So we have a guest in the studio. Thank you so much, Miss Dana. I'm coming right to you. My apologies on my end. I forgot to refresh the link. There's lots of things, folks, that are happening around the world, around the region, around the Caribbean and the United States of America and Europe and so on. And it's really important that we as Caribbean people keep abreast of these things for more reasons than one. Sometimes it's just interesting news, and other times it is shifting the very foundation of things that have been in place for a super long time. And, we have a saying that in the United States of America, they sneeze, but we're the ones who are going to catch the cold. So a lot of things that happen there have very much an influence on us. And it's just so interesting to keep on top of what is going on with them. So I am absolutely tickled pink to have this morning Miss Dana Thompson Dorsey. She's a JD and PhD. So JD is Juris Doctus, I think, law degree for those of you from the UK system. And she's an associate professor of education, law, policy, and leadership in the Department of Leadership, Policy, and Lifelong Learning at the University of South Florida. Now, you guys know that USF is my alma mater, so we always got to give USF a big shout out. Ms. Dana, good morning.
Good morning to you. How are you?
Oh, we're blessed. How are you?
I'm blessed and highly favored. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. We've got a listener to the program. That's her favorite thing to say when she calls in. She's like, Sandy, I'm blessed and highly favored. I said, yes, you are.
Yes.
So thankful. So thank you so much. We were just having a little chit chat before you joined the program. And my apologies, I forgot to refresh the link. But we're all good now. I see that in your email signature. I got to tell you, I absolutely love this quote that you have up by Malcolm X. Mm-hmm. And of course, you can tell us a little bit about your background. I see that you obviously a professor of law there, and looks like the who's who at USF in that department for sure. But I really appreciate, this particular quote from Malcolm X. And I'm going to just share it on the screen with our viewers, and I'll read it for everybody else listening in the radio. It says, I'm for truth, no matter who tells it. I'm for justice, no matter who it is for or against. I'm a human being first and foremost, and as such, I'm for whoever and whatever benefits humanity as a whole. Absolutely love it. I feel like that could be our mantra here on the CMR platform. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Miss Dana.
Well, I've been at USF for just 2.5 years now.
Okay.
And prior to coming here, I was at the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm from Pittsburgh originally, born and raised, and went there for law school as well as for my PhD in education, focusing on education policy and social and comparative analysis in education. And I'm also a graduate of Lincoln University outside of Philadelphia, which is the oldest historically Black college and university in the country to grant 4-year degrees. Also, the alma mater of Thurgood Marshall and Kwame Nkrumah and Langston Hughes. So I'm very proud of that legacy. But prior to my work as a professor, which I've been in academia about 15 years now, I practiced law. I think I have a little different entree into education and education law. I mean, I was a lawyer, but my focus was not education. I did not have a background in teaching. A lot of people are surprised by that, but it was just life and circumstances that led me back into, I guess, the education realm when I was practicing law for many years, doing civil defense litigation, meaning I was defending a lot of law firms. I was working for law firms and defending a lot of companies and corporations, and doing a lot of employment work, and really felt like that was not what I should be doing. So I started taking on pro bono cases.
Wow.
With the support of my law firm, at least
Yes.
shortly, for a brief amount of time. And I started working with parents who had children with special needs. And that's when I really started to learn more about education, and particularly the inequities in education. And started becoming, I guess, fascinated, but also burdened that I felt like I should be doing more. So started working with my church in Pittsburgh. I was living in Pittsburgh and practicing law in Pittsburgh at that time. And this was during the time, early 2000s, when There were the grants that were the faith-based grants. I believe this was under the George W. Bush administration.
Mm-hmm.
And my church decided to apply, and I helped write that grant. And that really got me focused on education, because we started working with a predominantly African American middle school in the city of Pittsburgh, where a lot of children, particularly Black males, were failing. And so we had decided to start a mentoring program working with the young males from 6th to 8th grade,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to work with them, and not just mentoring them in terms of academics, but also in terms of culture and community and spirituality. And then I started a reading and writing program after school, and it really introduced me to what a lot of young people, and including myself, it gave me an opportunity to actually reflect on my own educational experiences that I had
Mm-hmm.
not really done. I don't think a lot of us really do unless we're put in a situation where we have to. And
Right.
that's when I started asking questions. And I realized the only way they would be answered is if I went back to school and explored them. And people thought I was crazy. My family, like, you're going to leave this high paying job at this large law firm
Mm-hmm.
and go back to school for a PhD? Because at this point, I was probably 5 years in and close to that partnership track, which
Mm-hmm.
most attorneys aspire to. But suddenly my passion changed. And it was more about using my legal background to learn more about how some of these things, like tracking that happens in schools,
Mm-hmm.
the disparities that occur with having Black and brown children disproportionately assigned to special education, or the disproportionality in discipline, particularly in suspensions and expulsions. And
Wow.
I had to find out how that was legal and what I could do to change it.
Yes.
So 15 years later, here I am still doing that work. And
Wow.
when it comes to affirmative action or race-based admissions in higher
Mm-hmm.
education, that became my dissertation topic.
Wow.
And a lot of that was both the fascination that I had with critical race theory, which I had started learning about while I was working on my PhD, which is interesting. It wasn't
Mm-hmm.
while I was in law school, even though I graduated from the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, which is Derek Bell's alma mater. That's where he
Mm-hmm.
graduated from law school, and he's one of the founding people of critical race theory. But I
Mm-hmm.
didn't learn about it until I started working on my PhD. And I decided I wanted to really conduct an analysis around race-based admissions, because I started my PhD in
Mm-hmm.
2004, which was right after the Michigan cases, the Grutter v. Bollinger and Gratz v. Bollinger cases. And here we are.
Wow. So super interesting. My takeaway, of course, as I'm listening to you, it's just fascinating. You're right where you're supposed to be. You know,
Absolutely.
we
Absolutely.
say that all the time here in this program, and you are right where you're supposed to be. But the strength of that story, and I hope that people are really paying attention to it, is the path to where you're supposed to be is not straight and narrow. There's all sorts of twists and turns and loops and sometimes backward flips, and you might go backwards to then have to go forward.
Correct.
But all of the skills, the experience, everything that you talked about has led you to where your passion
Yes.
is. The law degree was not a waste. Those 5 years working in that law firm were all very valuable information, because I think you probably may not have even come to an understanding of, you're talking about representing people and seeing a lot of these issues that made you go, hold on a second here, this is a real area of concern. So kudos
Mhm.
to you,
Thank
and
you.
congratulations. And of course, JD, he's a alumni from USF as well. He says, go Bulls. We're always happy to
Yes.
see the amount of amazing staff that USF has at their disposal. And, it's been many, many years since I haven't been there, but it's a wonderful university. And to know that they have the caliber of, instructors, associate professors such as yourself, I think is just fantastic. So
Thank
one
you.
of the reasons, Dana, we wanted to have you on the program is there was a decision recently by the Supreme Court that kind of surprised me, actually. It wasn't a unanimous decision, but we'll get into some of the details of it. where basically, and the Supreme Court has been, I guess this is like their period where they issue and release a lot of their decisions. I feel like they've done
Yes.
a few in the last couple of weeks, but they've essentially reversed affirmative action. And I don't know why I always thought in my head, I also have a law degree, which, it's not logical to think this way, but I always thought, oh, that decision is fixed in stone. Clearly it isn't. So before we talk about the decision, can we talk about how, you know, sort of legislative decisions, such as what the Supreme Court issues, when they look at these cases, can actually change the course of a legal principle or case law that, a previous court said 25, 30, 40, 50 years ago that this is what it's going to be. And in the United States of America, because your judges are political appointments at the Supreme Court level, that is very, very interesting and has some serious implications from, who is going to put them in. Obviously, is the president of the United States, I think, who nominates them. So every time you have a political shift from a more conservative court to maybe a more liberal court, and if the pendulum switches the other way, it could mean the reversal of some very, very interesting things that have been almost, a steadfast legal position for a long time. So let's talk about that aspect of it, and then we'll get into the details of what the judges have done.
Yeah, so you're talking specifically about the politics.
Yes.
And that's what is problematic, because it was never supposed to be where Supreme Court justices are political. They are supposed to be lawyers, right? They're supposed to follow the law. They are supposed to follow what we call stare decisis, right? Let the law stand, legal precedents, which we know, given the history, particularly in the United States, could be problematic if we think about some of those decisions that came out, particularly when we talk about the 1800s, like a Dred Scott v. Sanford, and what that may mean when we talk about let the law stand. But the problem that we're noticing more and more, particularly in the past several decades, is that the political appointments that have been made have been ones where, and I would say definitely those that were made by Donald Trump, the three that were appointed, where they seem to be more interested in following or voting their ideology, political ideology, religious ideology, than they are in actually following stare decisis or legal precedent, or even where society is, recognizing what is actually happening in society, particularly around issues of racism and discrimination, not acknowledging that we have a long history of racism that still is very much present. And that lack of acknowledgement for the sake of political party and allegiance has become a problem. And we are seeing this more and more, and particularly in the last 3 or 4 decisions, including that one in race-based admissions and higher ed. And I always like to be specific by saying race-based admissions as opposed to affirmative action. Because affirmative action itself, which has a long history in the United States, was not one that was always about race, even though race was included. But it was about affirmatively having opportunities for those who lack those opportunities. And even if we go as far back as during the time of Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal, and even before that, it was about providing opportunities for unions and union members because of the discrimination against union members. And even more present day, when we talk about the existence in I guess, more blatant creation of affirmative action policies after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was more white women who benefited from affirmative action and still benefit from affirmative action than underrepresented minorities, such as African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans.
How is that possible? I mean, how does that work exactly?
Exactly. Well, the laws were just passed as such that they have been the benefits of it. If we even step back a lot farther, right, in history, and think about during a time of slavery. During that time, you had Africans who were property, right? Who they were owned by. They were owned by some of them being our founding fathers, but they were owned by they were slave owners.
Mm-hmm.
But these men also basically owned their wives, right? Their daughters. Their
Mm-hmm.
women at that time were property. They could not enter into contracts themselves. They could not vote. And but they still were able to gain rights a lot faster than those who were enslaved, even after the Emancipation Proclamation. We think
Mm-hmm.
about in the United States, the 15th Amendment in the Constitution is what is supposed to give everyone's the opportunity to have the right to vote.
Mm-hmm.
But that was not for Black people or even women. Women did not get that until the 19th Amendment. But Black people still were not able to
Mm-hmm.
vote. And we still struggle with voting, right?
Right.
That's why we had to have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And we're still talking about actually re-upping that, the Voting Rights Act, which sounds
Huh.
ludicrous when we have a constitutional amendment that was passed in the 1860s. And so, but it's white women, even when we talk about access to higher education,
Mm-hmm.
employment opportunities, pay opportunities in terms of having more equal pay with men. That's white women who have benefited from that so much more. White women make more money and have more higher positions
Mm-hmm.
in corporations and law firms, in medicine, in government, than black men and black women, and so the data has shown that it is white women who have greatly benefited. So the issue is not really affirmative action. The
Mm-hmm.
issue is race-based affirmative action, whether you're talking about employment or, in this case, admissions into
Mm-hmm.
private and public elite universities.
Right. So, of course, we have N.A. Smith here who says hiring in companies should be about selecting the best candidate for the job, not race, ideology, or whatever else. Thank you, Supreme Court of America, for righting that wrong. But that wasn't actually the decision. So, N.A. Smith isn't paying attention.
Right, right,
And then
right.
goes on to say, oh, more race baiting. And at that point, I just blocked them because if you don't even understand the fundamental topic here, the Supreme Court has not touched hiring. They've touched
Mhm.
education, which should be a universal right, in my opinion. So,
Right.
to be very, very clear, the Supreme Court decision is about race based affirmative action for college admission. So, N.A. Smith, pay attention now. It has nothing to do with jobs and hiring yet. It may get there, who knows? But that's not the discussion this morning. So, when we talk about, let's talk a little bit about the sort of context of race-based college admissions and why it was put in place. How did this come about in the first place? Decades old U.S. policy.
Yes, yes. So, in terms of college admission specifically, once again, this will go back to the time of, if we talk about, of course, slavery, where when those who were enslaved could not be educated. In many southern states, it was actually illegal to educate those who were enslaved. And so, once again, we're talking about those of African descent in the United States being hundreds of years behind in terms of access to even basic K to 12 or education. And the same with higher education. That's why during the time of I guess, Freedmen's Bureau Act, during the time of Reconstruction,
Mm-hmm.
pretty much the only thing African Americans had access to at that time was education, right? That people know that term 40 acres and a mule, which was included in the Freedmen's Bureau Act in 1864, but was quickly removed because of how it benefited those who were newly free slaves than it did those who were white and white refugees. So that was removed quickly. And so were a lot of other opportunities in terms of access to low interest loans for buying land or property. But the only thing that was left by 1866 in that Freedmen's Bureau Act was education. And so you had a lot of land grant institutions that were created that were specifically HBCUs. And so that is what predominantly would educate Black people. But a lot of those were based on agriculture, still working the land. And that's why you had a lot who just decided not to go to college, particularly in the South, and to become sharecroppers. And that would pass on from generation to generation. And then you had many who migrated to the North to take on other type of labor jobs or to attend colleges or universities, or they did that in the South and then migrated to the North to take advantage of opportunities in corporate America or even academia. But there had we still were dealing with Jim Crow laws. So the access that we had to education, even higher education, was not the same as our white counterparts. We were still competing, I guess, with our hands tied behind our backs, because oftentimes teachers, for example, I'll use teachers for example. A lot of teachers, K-12 teachers that were teaching our children had 2-year certificates, degrees. They didn't have 4-year college degrees, as many of the white men and women that were coming out of colleges and educating our children. There were also these issues of a lack of resources, and that would include access to books and libraries and all types of, I will say highly qualified professors, because I believe our teachers from K-12 into higher education were highly qualified, but still lacked access to the same knowledge as our white counterparts. Even if you think about lawyers, for example, it wasn't until 1948 where we had the LSAT. And so I don't think it was, just an accident that it was created during a time there was such a push, particularly in higher education, led by Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston, who at that time were working for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And they were working from the early 30s up until Brown v. Board, where they started focusing on K-12 and desegregating higher education, showing that separate but equal in higher education would never be equal. And so where lawyers prior to 1948, where the LSAT was created, were basically educated by being mentored by other lawyers. And, there was no bar exam, right? There was no LSAT. There was a form of bar exam, but the law school itself was a mentoring type of opportunity. You didn't have to take a test, right? You'd go, you go to law school and be mentored. It wasn't until 1948 where the LSAT was created, where, of course, those who were not getting access to that same type of education, and this goes for the SATs as well, even though that was created in like 1926. If you weren't getting access to that type of knowledge in terms of logical thinking, basically learning how to take a test, then you were not going to do well on that test. What would bar you from gaining access to undergraduate institutions, if we're talking about the SATs, which have also always been shown to be culturally and racially biased, and then the LSATs as well, if you wanted to attend law school. And we know that the most power that is had are those who have law degrees. That's why in the Grutter v. Bollinger case, the Michigan case, where up until 2 weeks ago, when the Supreme Court overturned the use of race-based admissions in higher education, Justice O'Connor talked about how race should still be used as a plus factor as long as individuals are being reviewed holistically, right? They're being viewed as individuals, not as a group, but their applications are reviewed, and race is just one of many factors that are considered. And she said the important, particularly in law schools, because that Grutter v. Bollinger case was dealing with Michigan law school. In law schools, it's particularly important to have that educational benefit of diversity, people from different backgrounds and walks of life, speaking in class on these legal cases and legal issues that surround us every day, because the majority of those who are governors are lawyers. The majority of those who are in our legislature, or at least a third, have have a legal background. Same with those who have held the office of United States president. The majority
Yes.
of them
Or lawyers.
are lawyers. And of
Wow.
course, we know, of course, our
Let
Supreme
that
Court
sink
justice.
in. Yeah, let's have that sink in for a minute because a lot of times, even here in the Cayman Islands, we talk about the importance and the value of having a good education, and it's really the access that it gives you to other opportunities.
Yes.
Going into good universities, and then there you're able to network and make connections, and that also gives you additional opportunities. But basically what I'm hearing you say, Dana, is that the playing field has never been even. Affirmative action didn't really make it even as much as people might want to think that that was the case. And even today, 2023, here we are, and the playing field still isn't even. And
Correct.
this the Supreme Court decision, which came down 2 weeks ago, will now make it even worse. This is a step backwards.
Correct. Correct. And we had, for example, in 1996, the state of California banned all affirmative action policies. So that was based on gender and race, religion, so on and so forth, and that included in higher education. They were the first state to move forward with adding that to the ballot, and the citizens of the state of California banned all use of affirmative action. And in the years that followed, that next decade, there was a 50% drop in applications to the UCal and Cal State system, particularly from Black and Brown students. And it took years and years for them to even recover from that. And a lot of that recovery was, of course, the recruiting efforts of UCal and Cal State system, but also just because the population that exist are predominantly and definitely Latino and African American. They have a large population of both. And so the applications, it just increased for that sheer reason, in addition to the recruiting efforts. But for at least a decade, there was a 50% drop. So you think about all of those young people that we lost in getting an education from top institutions like, the University of California, Berkeley, or the University of California, LA, UCLA, University of California, Riverside. I mean, you think about those who chose not to go to college at that point, all the great minds that we lost access to, those who may have cured cancer or different forms of cancer or Alzheimer's. And thinking about that happening across the country because of students who just thought that elite institutions like Harvard or UNC Chapel Hill, which I was a professor there as well for 7 years, they would never be able to go there. So just decided, I'm going to do a trade. Maybe I'll become an electrician or a plumber, which of course are amazing jobs if that's what you choose to do. But it shouldn't be you're settling for it because you don't think you have an access or opportunity at any of these elite institutions, or even those that are your great public institutions in your backyard.
Wow. Let's take a few questions. Of course, the phone line 93626 is open. We have Belika, who's an attorney under the UK system, asked the question, does the US Supreme Court sit outside its seat in Washington, D.C.? If so, does the state government pay for their expense, or is it just the federal government?
So let me understand what that means. Sit outside its seat in Washington, D.C. So what does that mean?
They only meet and sit and make their decisions in Washington. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
That's where they are in the Supreme
convene.
Court building in Washington, D.C. They convene in October. That's when the term always begins, and they start hearing oral arguments during that time, and the term ends at the end of June. And so the most controversial decisions, those that are always highly awaited, come out in the month of June, and during that last week are when the most controversial decisions come out, such as that which was the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and UNC.
Absolutely. Now, who brought the actual lawsuit? I mean, obviously, someone has to bring the challenge, right?
Absolutely. So, excuse me, but my headphones just deciding to fall out here. So sorry about that. So, so the organization is called Students for Fair Admissions, and it is basically funded by a gentleman, Edward Bloom, who for years, decades, has fought to end race-based admissions in higher education. And so he has funded different organizations where and would find plaintiffs. The organizations would find plaintiffs to bring these actions against different institutions. And so this particular case was focused on Asian students, and focused on Asian students who were not admitted into Harvard or UNC Chapel Hill because of their race-based admissions policies. And the interesting thing, it wasn't their arguments weren't that they were letting in too many African American or Latino students. It was actually that they weren't gaining access because more students who are white gained access, even though many of the Asian students who were part of this class action lawsuit had higher GPAs and SAT scores, and but oftentimes lower likability scores. And this was particularly at Harvard. This idea that that legacies, for example, gained more access, which the majority of legacies, meaning those whose parents or grandparents graduated from Harvard. In addition, any people who are staff or faculty working at Harvard, their children gain access to the institution. And it's about 30 to 40% each year of the freshman class who are legacies or children of faculty and staff, and also athletes, sought after athletes. So the idea that students can come in and check a box and gain higher consideration based on their racial background, and if there are legacies, that access to this top-notch education is more dependent on those check boxes based on race or who you know or who you're related to, is deemed merit-based as opposed to the GPA and SAT. And so SFFA students, the Asian students, had a problem with that.
So crazy. Now we have some interesting points here. So Rosemary says, "Good morning, Sandy. This lady is really interesting and highly educated." Eve says, "People should be accepted into higher education only if they try hard and meet the requirements, and not because of race or whatever other reason." Now, Eve, I hope that you're actually paying attention, because what Dana has just said, an assistant professor at USF who has, law degree, lots of experience in the United States system, and lots of, research knowledge behind her as well. What she's actually said is that there is a benefit to having a substantial benefit to having a parent, for example, who's an alumni at that school. That's your leg up. And so this concept of all things being equal for everyone does not exist in the United States of America, or in most places in the world, if you really had to be honest about it. So whilst you tote this ideal of, people should just be accepted for higher education, a lot of the Caucasian counterparts who get into these institutions don't get in based on any degree of equality. It's who you know, it's networking. We've seen the big case a couple years ago where celebrities and people in the know were paying to get into these schools, doctoring their entire kids' qualifications, claiming that they were in rowing teams and that they were athletes. And, this whole scandal that saw a couple celebrities go to jail. How does that, Eve, I wonder, for someone who thinks like you, because she says, why do you Black people with different opinions, I don't even know what that means, try to string a sentence together, but you try to make this about race. And the truth of the matter is, it's not Black people who are making it about race. It's always been about race, and it's always been about privilege. And if you are someone who has access to money, you automatically, we're going to be talking about a case of a little bit of privilege this morning. Someone comes into your jurisdiction charged with drugs, and you guys don't even know anything about it because she's a celebrity. Gigi Hadid, she's already gone. Y'all didn't know it happened until we put up the story last night. So be clear. Money gets you access. Race gets you access. Connections get you access. And so, unfortunately, historically, people of color have not had any of those leg up, right? So when you say, oh, we're going to give you a little bit of an extra point because you are a person of color, it doesn't really go far. It does not, you didn't have a situation where Harvard and Yale Law School was overwhelmed with people of color because all of a sudden, just because you were Black, you were getting into these institutions. It might have given you 1 or 2 little extra points on your application, but your white counterpart who has a father who could buy a building at Yale was still going to get preference over you. Let's put it in context and be very, very clear about what's happening.
Absolutely. And to also be clear, race is usually part of one of the factors, right? Because for the most part, Harvard, for example, they're going to consider first and foremost your GPA, your SAT. They're going to consider your extracurricular activities.
And all of those things, just to be clear, all of those things, your GPA, where you're coming from, all of those things are tied to privilege, which is oftentimes tied to opportunities, which is oftentimes tied to race. It's just a historical thing. Like, I don't know how people can even argue that exists. You know what I mean?
Right, exactly. I mean, I always say this idea of merit is really a myth. It's a myth because it is made up in terms of what we deem as merit. The bar always shifts. It gets a lot higher the moment where you have more African Americans or Latinos or Native Americans who are gaining more power, meaning they are actually matriculating in undergraduate and graduate and professional degrees, and then getting access to the political system or the legal system to be able to make change. And then suddenly there's a new bar put in place, not just test taking to even get in, but then a particular certification or test you have to pass to actually practice what you've learned for many years by studying a particular subject. And this has happened for many years. And so where race has become a plus factor, you can't get points for it. That's a quota that has been deemed unconstitutional years ago, 50 years, almost 50 years. So race as a plus factor means it can just be considered as maybe one of those personal factors, which is a factor that most universities consider, and personal factors such as your volunteer activities in the community or with particular organizations, or if you held leadership roles as part of your extracurricular activities or other positions that you may have outside of school. And race is just one of those personal factors. But the first thing always considered are what we call merit-based, which is that GPA, SAT, or LSAT, MCAT, GRE, depending on what program you're applying to. And that's going to be considered first and foremost. But the last thing, at least at Harvard, as they are going through the different admissions reviews, when you get to that last stage and you almost have that freshman class, the last thing they consider are those who are legacies. And so when they're making the final cut, those who make the final cut are the legacies, the children of professors and staff, and athletes. And the rest are thrown away. They make it through that whole entire admissions process. And when we still just have few hundred too many for our entering freshman class, that leg up goes to legacies, athletes, and particularly athletes of particular sports. I mean, we think athletes, think football and basketball. Oh, at Harvard, it's like squash, right?
Yeah.
And, that was the big
Growing.
thing, growing and squash.
Yeah.
And of course, those who are
Yeah.
children of staff.
Mm-hmm. All right. So Jonathan says, Sandra, just because someone has a different perspective, opinion, and or agenda from you, maybe that's the problem, the agenda part. But anyway, from you does not give you real world right to censor them and or block them if you wish to believe and or think that you are observing and or practicing any level of journalistic integrity. Well, this show is not about journalistic integrity. It is a talk show. And it is my talk show. I actually pay for the time. So, Jonathan, I'll have to disagree with you. On a matter of fact, if I wanted to block you, I can block you. That's my right to do so. So, just like Harvard can say, we don't want you because you're Black, or we're going to take you because you're for the right parents. That's life, Bobo. So it is what it is. Life is not meant to be fair. And you don't get to throw this tagline of journalistic integrity at me and think it's going to make one iota of a difference over here, because I actually don't care.
Right. And facts are facts. And for some reason, people don't want to hear the facts. So,
yes.
I mean, this is everything I'm telling you right now comes directly from the oral arguments that were made.
Yeah.
When this case was being argued last October, and then also written in the opinion, Justice Roberts' opinion that came out 2 weeks ago. So I'm not making this up and giving my opinion. I am quoting directly what was said and how their admissions process works. So that is the truth. And in terms of history is history.
Some people want to rewrite history, though. They want to put
their own spin on it.
So Balika says, great discussion. Also, few people can sacrifice the way you have to achieve greater goals for disadvantaged people. Blessings. Cameron going into reparations. That's not the discussion this morning, Cameron. That'd be a whole other show by itself. Johan reminding people that I do have the power to block you, and it just is what it is. He says, I spoke the truth. You spoke your truth, and you can speak your truth. That's on you, but I'll decide if you're going to be speaking your truth on my platform.
That's right.
That's the truth too.
Right. And so I always say truth is truth.
Florida.
Sorry about that. People speak their truth, but facts are facts.
Yes. Yeah. People think their truth are the facts. And I mean, I try to say all the time, this is an opinion-based talk show. So there's a lot of things that I will say on this show that is just my opinion. Take it or leave it. Doesn't matter to me. And then there are things that are facts. And, you shouldn't be able to argue with facts, you would think. But people seem to, confuse the two very, very easily. Garrett says, Jonathan, just sit down. All the way in the back of the classroom, by the way. So they've reversed affirmative action. What does this mean in real terms now? I saw a quote here. U.S. President Joe Biden said that he strongly disagreed with the decision, with the much anticipated decision. And he was quoted as saying, we cannot let this decision be the last word. Discrimination still exists in America. Why do people think discrimination, and even race-based discrimination, does not exist in America?
I think people want to fool themselves. I think they want to believe we've had these Civil Rights Act of 1957, 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Title IX, Title VII. I mean, people like to think that we've had so much legislation. And the end of segregation in schools and in employment and in higher education, that suddenly there's equality. But no, there is not. There's not equality and there is not equity. That's what we're still fighting for. Racism still exists, and you can look at statistics that will tell you that, even beyond those who are actually attending elite public and private institutions or higher ed institutions, or who are getting hired in jobs, or even in employment or versus unemployment rates. You always have Black and brown people who are on the bottom. And if we talk about infant mortality rates, those who have access to healthcare, we look at the wealth gap. I mean, the fact that white people make 10 times or have 10 times the amount of wealth, excuse me, don't make 10 times, because wealth is different than income, but have 10 times the amount of wealth than African Americans, right? And African Americans built the United States, literally with blood, sweat, and tears, built the
Yeah.
United States. Native Americans had their land taken from them. They are indigenous to the United States, and land was taken from them. Uh, and then African Americans and Natives also helped build the United States and have gotten not paid or any credit for it. That's when that young man was asking about reparations. That is a whole other show and couple of shows. But the point is, there should not be that wealth gap.
Yeah.
That should not exist if these particular civil rights acts have been actually doing what they're supposed to do. But the problem is that there are still practices that are in place to keep that gap in existence. Like when you talk about legacies, you know, if Harvard and UNC Chapel Hill as well, because they consider all these public and private schools have these legacies programs as part of their policies, right? Their SATs and GPAs don't matter as much. It only matters who they're related to and who they know, or how much money is donated to the university. We can even think about Donald Trump, for example. He was accepted into the University of Pennsylvania, into Wharton, because his father gave a ton of money to the institution, and he was a C and D student in high school. Okay, so he was a C student even at Wharton.
Right.
So, but we're supposed to think, because he brags about it all the time. Oh, I'm from Wharton. I went to, well, yes, you did, but you also cannot string sentences together. You cannot even use proper words or terms that exist. You just make them up. And so, but yet he can brag about that. He can brag about being a billionaire, even though his father gave him that money, and most of it he threw away, right?
But he was still able to get access to bank loans and lines of credit and all this stuff that nobody else, definitely not a person of color, and most even Caucasian people who don't have that connection, the bank would never even look at you. The bank would be like, you've got to be kidding. We have to be real about these things. Here's something of interest. When you were talking about healthcare, this came to mind about, what's being called the Black maternal health crises. Just in May of this year, Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health talked about, they did a special 3-part series on, the heightened risk faced by Black birthing people in the U.S. and the history of racism behind the crises and what can be done to address it by policymakers, hospitals, and practices, even community advocates, and a new generation of medical trainees. So it's shocking to know that Black women who give birth are more likely to experience life-threatening conditions like preeclampsia, postpartum hemorrhage, blood clots, as well as an increased incidence of other pregnancy-related complications like preterm birth and low birth weight. And there is, a connection to, when you look at the National Bureau of Economic Research, even some of the wealthiest Black women in California are still at a high risk of maternal mortality than the least wealthy white women. That's not a coincidence, right? CDC data shows that Black women are 2 to 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than their white counterparts. Again, a lot of it is maternal deaths and things that can be easily prevented.
Absolutely. I mean, we in the United States, Serena Williams, who is known around the world for being one of the greatest tennis stars in the world. She almost died herself from hemorrhage after giving birth. Well, she had a cesarean section, as many women do, and she almost died herself. And if it wasn't for the fact that she insisted, she went to the hospital numerous times and saying, something isn't right, I'm in pain, something's not right. And they just ignored her. And she had to insist that her doctor see her and check her out. And it's a good thing that she did, because she would have died. She would have hemorrhaged and died. And she is known around the world as one of the greatest tennis stars to ever exist, right?
Can you
Around the
believe it?
world, around
Yes.
the world.
Yes. And of course,
Right.
money was no object there. She's married to one of the richest people in the world as well.
Exactly.
So, but for the fact that she's a woman of color, she would have been taken seriously the first time she went and lodged a complaint about her health issues.
Right. And then most recently, that track star, I believe, Tori Bowie, died while she was suffering from a preeclampsia,
Mhm.
and could not get to the hospital, couldn't get to a phone to call an ambulance, and started hemorrhaging and was
Mm,
giving birth at the same time, and died at her home
mm,
while giving birth. But she could not do anything. Her blood pressure got so high, her body started
mhm,
naturally giving birth to her child,
mm,
and she died right in her home,
mm.
and was found later, hours
Wow.
later. And
Sunita, it's so crazy. Sunita says that good history lessons. Thanks a lot needs. That's a lot needs to learn. Delroy says, why don't the black billionaires don't give up some of theirs? Why die and leave it in the banks? Makes no sense to me. Can't blame white people anymore. We're the problem.
I can't
How
disagree
many
with
black
that.
billionaires do we have? Do we know? I mean, it wouldn't be
No,
as many as probably Delroy thinks to solve any
no,
real problems.
no,
I saw
no.
Rupert, I think it was Rupert Murdoch the other day, that said he could wipe away the US debt, which is in the trillions of dollars, if given, I think he said like 5 or 10 minutes or something.
Mhm.
Delroy, I challenge you to show me which African American billionaire has that power. Even the power to say it, much as I think that it's a real possibility. I'll wait on the answer, Delroy, to see if you can tell me.
Right.
Um,
I know there aren't as many that exist as we think. I mean, being a billionaire is is different
looks like
than
there's
being
10
a
of them.
millionaire or
Hold on,
wealthy, right?
I got a list here. I like research and I like
Oh
facts.
yes. Oh yes.
10 black billionaires in America. So this is according to billionaires. Well, let me find another source because I'm not so sure that that's the most accurate one. Hold on. Let me see if I can have Forbes or somebody talking about it. So Delroy, you expect 10 people who are billionaires and happen to be black to fix the world's problems, and then all the others that are white and Caucasian, they're going to sit back and do what exactly? I mean, is it interesting? Listen, I believe in diversity at all levels.
Mhm.
A lot of people say that, and then they're not going to break bread with an Asian person or a black
Mhm.
person here in the Caribbean. Oh yeah, I say that, but I'm not going to break bread with a Jamaican or a Caymanian from the other side of this little small island. To me, those things can be really, really ridiculous and really, really stupid.
Right.
Even in my personal life, I was joking yesterday about loving all flavors of the rainbow and all flavors of chocolate. I have dated white people from German descent. My ex-husband was white with blue eyes. Married to a Jamaican man at the moment. To me, it doesn't matter. You should try to push yourself outside of your comfort zone, because sometimes it really is just about experiencing different culture and different people and just being open-minded enough to accept people for who they are. But that also does not mean that I am blinded to the history of what
Mhm.
has happened to people. And I'll tell you what, Dana, this is a very, very interesting personal story. I was one of those Caribbean people who, even though I grew up and lived in the States for 15 years, when I was at USF, I still had this belief that, oh, race isn't that big of a deal. Don't worry about it. Set it to the side. Just work hard and you'll get places in life. Didn't really understand the historical impact of race. And this is
Mhm.
why learning the American history is so incredibly important. And,
Mhm.
even our own Caribbean history. But
Mhm.
my very last term at USF, I had some credits that I just had to make up credits. So, this is when you're going to take whatever you can, basket weaving, just to be like, okay, let me hurry up and get out of here. No more money left. I need to get on to get a real job or to continue on to that master's or whatever else it is that you're going to do. And I saw in the syllabus, it was a course, and it was an online course, which back in these days, this was like the mid 1990s,
Oh, yeah.
95, 96. It was really unusual to have an online course, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And it was an online course called it was like Black history or African American history, but it's focused on a specific period of time in the historical context. So a lot of it was like the 50s and 60s and whatever. And you know what? I learned so much in that class, and I walked away with a greater understanding, in particular, of the African American experience, which is in many respects unique and different. And I thought about it. There are people who are alive in America today who either their parents or maybe even them, depending on how old they are, were slaves.
Right.
And they are a product of the John Crow mentality. They've seen lynching. They've seen some really horrific things that the vast majority of us cannot relate to. And this course showed videos and pictures of people who were hung from trees and who were lynched, right? And I thought to myself, my God, how can human beings be capable of this type of behavior and do this to people just based on the color of your skin? Because you cut, and we all cut the same, we all bleed the same. You know, slave farms, you know, forcing women who were raped and sexually abused to just produce because it was cheaper to produce your own slaves than to bring them in from Europe and pay that price. And, you know, I was watching a video the other day on this on YouTube, and it was talking about how slave farms were so popular and such a money grabbing business that it was more lucrative at one point than actually the owning of the plantation itself. If you could produce enough grapes, you could then sell them for a premium price. And so there were people who started out in the plantation business who quickly became just producers of slaves.
Exactly. Because, you know, well, first, let me say this. The United States only had about 4% of the world's slaves, right? There were far more slaves in the Caribbean islands, right? In South America, Central America, than there were even in the United States. But like you talked about, the brutality, the determination of looking at those enslaved as property, not humans, right? And I mean, you know, has gone on for years and still exists in many respects, because you still have lynching that exists. I mean, example, George Floyd, which I'm sure you're probably familiar with that story in the United States. So it still exists. And, you know, what I have never understood, and I think is probably weighs on a lot of people, is there has been proof positive that every human being, mankind, began on the continent of Africa. And race is just a social, which has become a political and legal construction, an economic construction. The only thing that makes us different is melanin. We all have melanin. Just some have less than others, depending on where your long distance relatives migrated to from the continent. And we have more genetics that are similar, right? Like, in fact, if you know, you said you were in the United States for maybe about 15 years, but you've spent most of your life in the Caribbean. So your genetics are probably more similar to those who may be of a lighter or white skin in the Caribbean than mine in the United States. Why? Because our genetics are based on geography. And when I did ancestry.com, right, and found that, you know, my ancestors have been in the US, well, at least, I mean, I was able to at least get back to the early 1800s. And I also know that is, like many of us, have that white blood, because like I said, race is a social construction that is Scottish and Irish and from, you know, English and Wales. You know, I have more genetic similarity to white people who have the same ancestry in the US as I do, meaning we may be third, fourth, fifth generation in the US.
Yes.
So our genetics are more similar than perhaps you and my genetics, because geographically, I've been in the same place with those who have less melanin in the US. than you and I, who have the same amount, similar amount of melanin, but you've been in the Caribbean most of your life, and maybe your ancestors have been as well.
Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I know here in the Caribbean, a lot of people are. I even see it here in the Cayman Islands. A lot of people are wanting to claim their white ancestry, even if it's a very, very small part. I did my 23andMe, and about 19-20% European out of the UK, whatever. I'm not jumping on that. Like, oh yes, let me go ahead and claim my English accent to it. But I find that again, it's a matter of self-love and appreciation, right? If I'm 80% something, why am I going to be jumping up and down? But can I tell you about my Scottish ancestry? No, nobody don't care about that. You're black.
You're black. Exactly.
And the rules in America that were, created by, racist people said if you have 1 ounce of Negro blood, you are black for everything. Right. And yet there are people who you look at them and you're like, you try to pass for white, but let's do a DNA test and you find out, oh my God, I'm 70%, this or that. And you talk about melanin, and this is so interesting because many years ago, I was listening to an NPR program, and there was a guy who lived his entire life as an African-American, as a black guy. When these DNA tests became available, he took a DNA test, and lo and behold, he's not black at all.
Oh, really?
I mean, his 1%.
Right.
It's just like he came out looking, and his entire family accepted that they were black people when in fact they were not. And it was such a fascinating show because then the premise of the interview was, if you could relive your life as a white person, what would that mean for you? Because you're actually white.
Right. I mean,
like, oh my God.
But see, that's a prime example of how race is just a social construct, right? That has become a political, economic, and legal one, right?
Yeah.
So we always have to check these boxes on everything we do. To talk about.
It's so crazy.
On everything, right?
Yeah.
No, you're applying for loans. If you are, the census, of course, is a prime example. It's all based. And so, this family, this gentleman that was on this show, he probably was very fair skinned, but that was because of melanin. But the dominant gene, right? His dominant gene, he thought, oh, I must be African American because his skin was a little darker than maybe the lightest of white people that he had been around, and just assumed that, but then does this test and we're like, oh no, I'm Irish, Scottish, I'm, what we call white. But what we call white is just less melanin based on where you had ancestors migrate to from the continent of Africa. People don't like to believe it. But it is true. And so, you go back far enough, thousands of years, if you had family who migrated to those parts of the world where there was less sun, there was less need to have darker skin and thicker hair to protect you from the sun. And so thousands of years of having ancestors there, yes, your skin's going to look white. Your hair may be thinner and blonder and all of those things. We're not going to talk about eye color because I'm sure all of us know plenty of people with darker skin who have green, gray, hazel, blue eyes, right? So it's not as much about that either. But the melanin in your skin, the thickness and texture of your hair is basically based on where their ancestors over thousands of years lived and migrated to, or were forced to migrate to, whether it was the Caribbean or South America or, and even the United States. But they were coming from the African continent, where you're close to the equator. It's very hot. You need to have that more melanin and, and that thicker hair to help protect you. And so that's all it is. But it was, in the United States, at least, I mean, I'm sure it's definitely different across the world. But in the United States, in the mid 1600s, where you had Black people who were enslaved, who were indentured servants, along with white people and Native Americans who were indentured servants or enslaved, decided to rebel, what's called Bacon's Rebellion. And Nathaniel Bacon, who was white color, brought up this, he wanted to rebel against the planters class, those who were plantation owners and producing all the different, cotton and rice and tobacco, and were using slaves and indentured servants to work the land. They decide to rebel. But prior to that time, there were black and white and, yellow and red. And I'm using that because that's actually written in the early Supreme Court case when talking about the difference between white and non-white.
Oh, really?
They actually say black,
red.
Red, yellow, black. Yeah, they actually use that. It's just hilarious.
Oh my God. Let's read a few comments here. We've got Ava says, I love this program. It's very informative. Natasha says, thank you, Sandy, for having these amazing experts on your show and furthering people's education. This is so vital. Theophilus says, it's really sad because no one can choose their skin color. Natasha says the US is going back a century or two in this time at the moment. We'll never move back there. Gina says, so true. I think if everyone did the 23andMe DNA test, our eyes would be opened. And by the way, Gina and I, turns out we're cousins based on their 23andMe results. I love it. Gina says, I went to college in Arkansas and Mississippi. And one thing that came up was that I could always pass as white. I never had to think about that until I went to college in 2 southern states. Tropical Boutique says, Sandy, speak the truth. And Delroy says, that doesn't add up. Africa is the only place man evolved from on the planet. Delroy, please, my friend, you have got to educate yourself. You see, that statement, and I'm not trying to make you feel bad, but that statement is why we have people like Dana on the show. It's why sometimes, as much fun as we have on this program, and as much as we want to talk about some of these social issues, we got to get back to basics. Because unfortunately, a lot of people don't have the basic knowledge and understanding. Scientists are sure that Homo sapiens, which are our predecessors, right, first evolved in Africa. So that means that every person alive today can trace their genetic ancestry there at some point. Do I need to say that again? Yes. All of us evolved from Africa.
Yes. The research has shown it time and time again.
Yes, that's a fact.
Yes.
So began in one single East or South African population that eventually spread into Asia and Europe. Go and look it up.
Yes.
National History Museum has a very interesting article, Delroy, on this. You've got to, because everything that you think and everything that you say flows from the fact that you don't even know that the human race came from Africa. So even when you made a comment about, oh, African-American billionaires, why don't they solve the world problem? It's like, folks, come on. Callie, thank you. Caribbean history. She says, do your research. Ava says, we all have the mother gene out of Africa. These things are important. It is critical for you to expand your knowledge base and your understanding of the world beyond what your mama told you or your grandma told you, because they didn't know any different.
That's oftentimes why Africa is called the motherland, right? Because that's where
we have access. This is the part that really kind of grinds me now, right? We have the access. It might not always be equal, because there's still a lot of places in the world that don't have internet penetration and this, that, and the next thing. But by and large, there is greater access today to information. You just got to make sure your information is accurate and pay attention to the sources that you're getting it from, because with the social media and all this stuff, not all information is good or accurate information, but there is a lot of good and accurate information out there. There's a publication, Trends in Ecology and Evolution. Go and have a look at that. I mean, you gotta educate yourself. Don't stay where you are from the perspective of your knowledge base. Never remain stagnant in your knowledge. That's why I say people sometimes, oh, Sandy, you think you know everything? I'm like, I am the first person in the world to want to learn more and to admit that I know very little, in fact. Share the information with me. I'm willing to soak it in and take it up. That's why I love inviting people like Miss Dana here on the program, because she's an expert in a particular area. Good morning, caller. Welcome to the program.
Morning. Um, I'd like to ask your guest if she could share with us what some of the concepts that would have existed in the Jim Crow laws and the Black laws that made those laws wrong.
So, in terms of Jim Crow, I will say during Reconstruction, when in the United States, when you had your 14th Amendment, your 13th Amendment, what was supposed to abolish slavery or in any type of involuntary servitude, your 15th Amendment addressing voting, that was during the Reconstruction era. But as we moved into, and particularly in the South, as you move beyond Reconstruction, you had Black codes that still existed in the South and in places like South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, where Black people had to be in the house at a certain time at night, or they would be arrested. They had to have employment, or they could be arrested or killed. And then in terms of Jim Crow, we moved into that time as well. And it specifically took hold after the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, which is 1896. That is the case that brought about the separate but equal concept or law. And as so let's think about this idea of one drop of Black blood. So where you had Plessy, who by appearance looked white and was 7/8 white, but 1/8 Black, gets into a rail car in Louisiana that was designated for white people, not for Black people. And in the law in Louisiana was that you had to have separate rail cars based on the color of your skin. Someone happened to know that Plessy, who lived his life as a white person, had this 1/8 Black blood and was told to move to the Black rail car. He refused to do so. And so he was arrested, thrown in jail. But what advanced to the Supreme Court and was decided in 1896 was that although he may be white to the eye, that 1/8 Black blood meant that he had to abide by the Louisiana law and any other laws where there's a separation of the races, right? Which means he should have moved to the Black rail car. He should have been arrested by not complying with the law. And so that established this mandate of separate but equal and Jim Crow law and separating people by race, having separate schools, which, by the way, already existed. In fact, in the decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, they cited a case that came out of the Massachusetts Supreme Court in 1849, Roberts v. City of Boston, where parents had challenged the law in Massachusetts where Black children or children of color, because it included, those students who are also Asian or Latino, or that they were non-white, had to go to a different school than white children, and parents challenged it. And the Supreme Court of Massachusetts established this idea that they are different social class, they are not on the same level simply based on their race, and so that the law to separate the races in schools is legal and constitutional based on that Massachusetts Constitution. And so it was Plessy v. Ferguson who then followed, even though it was a United States Supreme Court, followed a state Supreme Court law and cites it, and also goes on and uses similar language by saying that although we have equal protection under the laws, under the 14th Amendment, no legislation can make people equal on social class. People have the right to be separated for those who are of a lesser class. And so equal, as long as you still have the same rights, they don't have to be in the same place. And that's when Jim Crow was born. Separate bathrooms, restaurants, hotels, schools,
Mhm.
water fountains, sitting on the back of the bus, right? A
Mhm.
separate section, even on a bus. You have access to the bus. That's equal protection. You just can't sit with those who are of a higher class because of their white identity. And
Wow.
so that was Jim Crow. And that is what then, like as I mentioned earlier, Thurgood Marshall
Mhm.
and Charles Hamilton Houston, working for the NAAC Legal Defense Fund, challenged on a higher education level from the mid 1930s up until 1950s, where
Mhm.
we then know about Brown v. Board. That was
Mhm.
argued numerous times before it was finally decided in 1954. But prior to that, they were fighting in higher education, and at least got the Supreme Court to say that education has to be substantially equal. Doesn't have to be completely equal, but substantially equal. And in some
Mhm.
cases, one to the point where they had to let Black students into particular graduate programs or undergraduate programs because there was not a similar HBCU that had that particular doctorate or had a law school. And so if they wanted to be educated in their state and that there wasn't a Black law school or a Black medical school, the white university had to accept them. So they were starting to break down those laws in higher education, but they took on a whole other fight when you're talking about young children in Brown v. Board. And so, parents put up a much bigger fight than,
Mhm.
people didn't care as much when you're talking about adults. But once it came down to K to 12, and then that's when we, really started hearing more about the civil rights movement that became very active in the 50s as well, because of these different laws in terms of buses and where you sit on buses, right? That's where we had the march, the march in Montgomery. But then there was also the difference in how workers were being treated because of union differences, right? Because of teachers, in fact, and school leaders who were treated differently and paid differently and couldn't be unionized, because they were separate from their white counterparts who were doing the exact same work. So all of the civil rights movement was happening at the same time that we know about, like Brown v. Board 1 and 2 in 1954, 1955. But you had the SNCC, and you also had, which Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was working with, that young youth group, and John Lewis, our late great senator, was a part of that group. Were also fighting for civil rights and to end Jim Crow laws during that time in the 50s, and then of course in the 1960s, which led us to those Civil Rights Act or acts. So I hope I answered your question in terms of Jim Crow.
Yeah. What mechanisms are used today to achieve the same goals that were sought after back then? And how do they continue to implement those views, and like in practical terms, how does a human experience the discrimination today?
Okay, so one significant way that I did not mention, and I'm going to go back to that 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, except for that loophole. Except if you are in prison, you can work for free. That involuntary servitude is constitutional under the 13th Amendment. And what do we see in our prison systems in the United States, which is the largest prison industrial complex in the world, or a prison system that is made up of predominantly Black and Brown people? They're 5 to 10 times the amount of those in prison are Black or brown versus white. They get longer prison sentences. So they are now the slaves of today. If you read, I don't know if you're familiar with Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. That book just celebrated, I believe, its 10th year. I think she had a new edition that came out because of that 10th year of this book being in existence, and it's been on the New York Times bestseller list for years, tells that story of how we continue to enslave Black people, particularly with the prison industrial complex. And then you also have numerous states, namely in the South, that bar former felons from voting ever again. And so imagine if you have this high percentage of Black men and women who are in prison, and then they come out, they serve their time, but because they committed a felony, some states it's only if it's a violent felony, some if it's any felony, can no longer vote ever again. Right? That limits your voice and the ability to change or challenge any of these inequities that exist in society. So a lot of what we see comes through our criminal and legal justice system. And then I also mentioned the wealth gap, wealth being those who have home ownership, business ownership. They have more revenue coming in than leaving, right? They have this very impressive balance sheet of assets than compared to liabilities. And so white people have 10 times the amount of wealth of Black people. And that has existed across the board. If you look at education.
And can I just ask you a quick question about the incarceration bit? Is that regardless of what you're incarcerated for? That some states block you from voting?
If so, like I said, if it's a violent, some states say only if it's a violent felony. So if you were convicted for rape or murder, then you'll be blocked from voting. Or in some cases, it's even if you may be blocked from voting until all of your fines and restitution is paid. And oftentimes because of interest, it's thousands of dollars. It's never paid, so they can never vote. But then in other states, it's any felony. So it could have been a minor drug charge. It could have been, I'm thinking about in Florida right now, for example, it is a felony to continue for librarians, for example, to continue to have banned books in the library, which by the way is unconstitutional, but to continue to have banned books in the library is like a third-degree felony and a librarian, could be convicted of that. So now Florida voted, which has been 5 or 6 years ago now. Florida citizens voted for those who are ex-felons to have the right to vote again. But how the supermajority of conservatives in the legislature held that up, and this was interestingly during the first run, Governor DeSantis was running for governor, and that's when he was running against, I can't remember his name, the Black man he ran against. What they did is to hold up those ex-felons who now had the right to vote, was requiring them to pay restitution before they would have access to vote. So at that time, Andrew Gillum, that's his name, that was the Black man that was running against current Governor DeSantis in that first election. And at that time, I think he only won by like 30,000 votes, DeSantis over Gillum. But it was, I don't know, about a couple 100,000 ex-felons who could not vote in that election because the legislature passed a law. Even though the citizens voted, they should have about a landslide. Ex-felons should have the right to vote again. The legislature held it up by saying, no, not until they pay all of their fines and restitution. So imagine how different that election would have been if the legislature had not passed that law right before that first election, that DeSantis only won by 30,000 votes, because the majority of those, over 100,000 people who, let's not mention those who were just dropped from the rolls, right?
And let's put this in context, right? Among men, African American men, 28.5%, are about twice as likely as Hispanic men,
Mhm.
16%, and 6 times more than likely as their white counterparts at 4.4% to be admitted to prison during their life. And again, the facts are there. It doesn't matter what the offense is, you're more likely to go to prison if you're Black.
That's right.
Simple as that. So we do
And
have
have longer sentences and have
and
longer
get longer sentences. So Derek
sentences.
says people like her are the reason crime is so high right now. So we're going to blame crime on people like you, Dana.
Mhm.
She wants to release all Black and brown criminals based on skin color. Did you at some point say that during the show?
No, not at all. Did not say that.
Okay, so Derek, you got to pay attention. Denny, anything else for us?
Yeah, one more question. How does either law enforcement or other agencies of government use discretion, or should I say abuse discretion, to achieve those same ends?
So once again, so let's also step back, and this is something that I think Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton were really slammed on, and probably rightfully so, I guess, in some cases, that if there was a law that passed that 3 times you're out, those 3 strikes you're out, that you go to prison, and you go to prison for a long amount of time, regardless of what the crime was. So you had a lot of Black and brown people, for example, who were petty drug dealers, or they may have stolen a car. And this could even take place during the time they were juveniles, right? Or just becoming adults, let's say 18. But you have some states, even where 16, you are tried as an adult, right? Regardless of what the crime is. And so let's say you stole a car. Let's say you were caught with a couple of ounces of marijuana. And then, the third time, let's say you had a registered gun on you. 3 strikes, you're out. You are now going to prison, and you're going to prison for a long time, because that third strike compounded with the other 2 felonies, even though we may consider those minor, like petty felonies. The judges have discretion on how they may sentence you if you are found guilty. And once again, ton of literature on unconscious or implicit bias in juries and being tried by your peers. And even if some of those peers are the same color as you, because unconscious bias, it doesn't matter your race, gender, and so on and so forth. We all have them. And so you're then convicted. All right. And then the judge sentences you and has a wide discretion on that sentence that you may receive. You may receive a suspended sentence all the way up to 20 years or 25 years in prison, let's say, for that gun charge. Oftentimes what would happen to Black and brown people, and more so to Black people, is the judge would then sentence them based on that gun charge, that upwards of 20 and 25 years. Even though that was the third strike, and the other 2 strikes was an ounce of marijuana and joyriding in the stolen car.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how the system is perpetuated, because of those sentencing guidelines. So we, on the news for years, and it definitely comes out during election seasons, and, being soft on crime, or how hard you are on crime, and whether, and definitely during the presidential and seasons, that this idea of trying to change sentencing guidelines because of the inequities that exist against Black and brown people will determine whether or not you're soft on crime, or if you're big on crime. So the person who made the comment by saying, oh, we should release people based on their color, no. If you commit the crime, you do the time, but you should not be forced to do the time longer than your white counterpart, or you were found guilty because you have a public defender, because you can't afford a high-powered attorney, a busy public defender who does not have time to try every single case, right, to give you proper defense and try every single case and ask you to plea out.
Yeah.
And you plead out and plead guilty, you're definitely getting a higher sentence. Versus if you are white, wealthy, or just have the right connections, you can hire an attorney who will plead you out for lesser, or will have you go to trial where you are found not guilty because prior to that gun charge and that ounce of marijuana that you had and that petty joyriding theft that's on your record, they're also talking about how you were a choir boy most of your life and how you volunteer at the pet shelter every Sunday and how you are on scholarship at the University of Michigan. Suddenly, you're not going to ruin your life by sending you to prison. We're going to give you community service and you can go enjoy that scholarship at the University of Michigan. Not guilty. So that's how it's played out oftentimes.
If you had unilateral authority, what change would you make in the Constitution to address the issues that you see are wrong?
Well, the first thing I would do in terms of the checks and balances that are supposed to exist in our Constitution, the structure of our government, we have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And what we have learned is that the judicial branch is not really checked at all. They are not held to any ethical standards. They serve a lifetime term. And so that would be one of the first things I would change. Number one, no more lifetime appointments. You can be appointed and you have maybe a term of 10 years or 15 years, or maybe even this age requirement of, 75 years, you have to retire. But 10 to 15 years, that's it. And that's for this reason, like what we have found out over the past several months is Justice Clarence Thomas has been, and Justice, I don't want to get it wrong, but I believe it's Alito or Gorsuch, but I don't want to get it wrong. So I'll have to go look it up. But it's one of the other more conservative justices have been wined and dined and going on yachts and vacations with these very wealthy Republican donors. In fact, one particular Republican donor who's given a lot to Republican politicians around the country, and particularly those running for president who are running as Republicans, has been doing this for the entire time Justice Thomas has been a Supreme Court justice, which has been since the 1980s. He took the place of our beloved Thurgood Marshall. And so, and this man even bought his mother, Clarence Thomas's mother, a house. And, but because there are no ethical standards to police, right, the Supreme Court, even though these standards exist for the executive branch and for the legislative branch, like you would be impeached as a president, right, as part of the executive branch if this happened, or could be. That doesn't exist for the Supreme Court. So, while that's not, in the Constitution, I would take away the lifetime appointments and add in term limits and age limits. And then in terms of legislation, I would require ethical guidelines that don't exist right now. And that's why nothing is happening to Clarence Thomas or the other justice who takes all these money and gifts. They have to report certain gifts, but they've not reported this, and it's been okay because there's no ethical standards.
Wow. Shocking.
Right.
Well, thank you for your time.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you for your questions.
Real eye opener here today. Balika says, I've read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. It has parallels with Lenin Christian's Caymanian justice system regarding how it disadvantages Caymanians in our own context. We have Tamikia says, I'm from South Carolina. I love this show, Sandy. I understand all that she's talking about. A lot of people have experienced it. Gina says, thank you. No lifetime appointment. Cameron is asking about your political affiliation because people in America always think that your political affiliation has, something to do with your ideology around race and that sort of thing. So he wants to know if you're a Democrat.
I am. I am a registered Democrat. It doesn't mean that I always vote Democrat. I haven't always voted Democrat. I vote based on ethics, morals, issues, not one particular issue like abortion, where you have some people who are Republicans only, because of that issue or certain issues. I always do my research on candidates, and I vote based on moral ethics and those I think will really be good, honest leaders. But I am a registered Democrat, and I'm not ashamed of saying that because I just try to educate people on facts. And sometimes those facts don't always play in favor of Democrats.
Right. All right, folks, 9362626. We're going to start to wrap up with our guests a little bit here now. I've got Balika saying that even in Cayman, we have a complaint procedure against judges, though it's ineffective, and a code of conduct. Surely the U.S. should do better. Should do better and actually doing better, I guess, are two very, very different things. Tamika responding to Derek saying that she she's never said that in reference to just letting all people out of prison who are people of color. She never said anything near that. In fact, Jim says none of these politicians in the U.S. have any moral ethics. The government of highly corrupt. One party is just as bad as the other anymore.
Can't disagree.
And that's why she said she votes her conscience. She doesn't vote party line, although in the U.S., I should know this because I obviously lived there long enough, but I didn't really get into U.S. politics. Do you have to register as one thing or another? You can register as an independent, right?
So it depends on what state you're in, whether or not you can register as an independent, or you can register as part, like even in Florida, they have like a party called the Florida Constitution Party, and you can register as that. But the issue becomes whether or not you can vote in primaries. And so, like I mentioned, I am from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, if you are not a registered Democrat or Republican, you cannot vote in the primary. And if you are a registered Democrat or Republican, you have to vote your party in the primary. Now, you can vote for whoever you want in the general election, but in the primary, you have to vote your party. And it's like that in many states. So you can register in some states, in a lot of states these days, as an independent or in one of these other parties that exist. But whether or not you can actually vote in the primaries is what makes the difference, because you may not have the candidate you want come the general election because you are barred from voting in the primaries.
Wow. Well, Ms. Dana, thank you so much. This has been extremely enlightening. I, for sure, have learned a lot from your discussion today. I do want to invite you back on the program at some point.
I'd love to come back.
Because this is just absolutely amazing information. Yes. I'm just seeing your message. Perfect timing that you've got to go to a research meeting as well. Knowledge and information, folks, is what this show really tries to put forward. I do make an interesting observation. Anytime we have an expert on, yes, we've still got good numbers, over 200 people still on the live stream, but it's nowhere near the number of people if I were here talking about somebody's personal life and who they're sleeping with and who they owe money to and all these salacious things that is also part of the platform. We don't try to do that every day, but I do notice the stark difference between when people should be learning something and getting educated and furthering themselves versus let's just talk people business and pure sauce. Double the numbers. And I think that says a lot about us as a people. And we have to understand that the one singular thing, Weeby says, very interesting class today, folks, the one singular way in which anybody will keep you down in this life is your lack of information, your lack of knowledge, and your lack of understanding. Yes. They can't take that away from you once you've got it in your head. Anything else they can take. They'll put financial things in place. You might not even be able to get into Harvard and Yale anymore. But you can go out there and you can learn and you can be educated. You can articulate yourself and no one can take that away from you. That's right. And that will give you opportunities. Everybody's like, oh, Black people must create their own opportunities. It's not as easy as that, but you're in a much better position to do so if you're educated. That's why we have to put so much emphasis on education for our people across the entire globe, across the entire world. And the fact that we, even on this program, see the numbers dip and people are like, oh, I don't want to learn about that. That speaks volumes to how we have been indoctrinated. We've accepted to our core the indoctrination that we're going to be dumber, we're going to be stupider than other people. And, we're going to just put out misinformation out there. And that's what it is. Dana, thank you so much.
Can I just make one final comment?
Yes.
Since we were originally talking about race-based admissions in higher education, I would say maybe one bright part of the Justice Roberts decision in that case is that the decision does not block students who are writing in their personal essays the opportunity to discuss race. So students can still talk about how they've overcome particular challenges due to racism or discrimination in their essays. So in that case, admissions committees don't have a choice but to consider that. So, and so Justice Roberts was very clear on that. The decision in saying that race cannot no longer be a plus factor or any decision in the admissions process, it does not block students from discussing it. As how something.
And this is why, again, you read the case and you understand what that means, because you still work it in there if you're smart enough. If you haven't been paying attention and you haven't read the case or the implications of the case, you don't even put that in there. You might be giving yourself 1 point less, which could have made a difference. Who knows?
Right.
As Dean says, knowledge is power. That's the truth.
Yes.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I look forward to hopefully coming to your show again.
Most definitely.
It's been an honor. Thank you.
All right. We really, really appreciate it. All right, folks, let's take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back after these messages.
For 20 years, we've committed to helping the people of the Cayman Islands live longer, healthier, and happier lives. But healthcare and the expectations of patients are rapidly evolving, and so must we. We have made incredible clinical and technological advancements and achieved JCI accreditation, the internationally recognized gold seal of approval for patient safety and quality of care. So it's time for our image to reflect our transformation from a local hospital to a world-class healthcare authority with a new logo that symbolizes national duty and pride, a statement that reinforces our commitment to our patients every step of the way, with colors as bold as our mission to provide the highest quality healthcare. Dynamic, professional, skilled, committed, caring. This is HSA.
Now, y'all love Popeyes for my fried chicken, but the real ones also love my salty, flaky, covered in butter biscuits. Well, biscuit fans, have I got a treat for you. Introducing new irresistible strawberry biscuits at Popeyes. The perfect balance of salty and sweet thanks to decadent strawberry bits baked right in and mouth-watering creamy icing on top. The perfect dessert for just $2.29, or grab 6 pieces for $12.59.
Strawberry biscuits forever.
Not forever, I'm afraid, honey. Limited time only, and only at Popeyes Louisiana Kitchen on Eastern Avenue.
Ocean Ridge Heights offers an amazing opportunity to own a piece of land in idyllic Cayman Brac, right on the bluff, starting from $80,000. Located in a quiet residential area with high elevation, these lots are ideal for a future home or investment property and are sure to go fast. Cayman Brac offers a laid-back lifestyle, amazing pristine diving, limestone caves, diverse flora, along with amazing wildlife. Inquire about the owner financing options so that you can secure your piece of paradise today. With only a few lots remaining, these are sure to go before you know it. Contact Crichton Properties today on 345-949-5250 or info@crichtonproperties.com.
Recover Personal Injury Attorneys, helping injured people get what they deserve. Did you know that insurance companies have lawyers that represent their interests? Before signing and accepting any settlement, know your rights. Call us today for a free consultation at 924-9999. That's 924-9999. Recover. Your personal injury attorneys are on standby to assist.
All right, folks, welcome back to another edition of The Cold Hard Truth. Good morning. Buenos dias. So we're going to talk about one other topic here today. Thank you so much for your comments. Gina says truth. Dean says knowledge is power. Miss Rosemary said so true. Derek says she's talking about race. Here in Cayman, it's not about that. It's about your nationality. A Caymanian will go to jail time versus any other nationality. Again, Derek, I'm going to encourage you to really try to fact check that. The thing about it is in this country, we don't collect any data based on race. So you wouldn't know that information. That's just your opinion. You cannot be basing that on anything factual because no one has collated that data. But as someone who has sat for probably more time than most people, unless you're a hardcore criminal, in the penal system, looked at the criminal justice system and how it works, I can tell you that even amongst the quote unquote Caymanians, those who will pass as elitists and white, they will get a different type of access to the justice in the penal system than the others. It's as simple as that. And that's a fact that, again, in a way, it's an opinion and an observation that I've made because I've sat there. No one can tell you. If someone's in jail, I suppose they can look around and try to count the brown people versus the lighter skinned Caymanians, and you can talk about the implications of that. But sadly, we have to accept that that's a very real possibility here as well. Caller, good morning.
Good morning, Sandy. Congratulations for having that guest on. I will be very brief because I know that you're about to move to a new subject. Mm-hmm. You see, I follow these kinds of subject matters very well. And yet, even for me, there are some little tidbits of information I didn't know which she was able to bring up. But my main reason with my call is just to emphasize that if you can, I recommend to everybody in Cayman to read that book, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. I read it, and I remember that when I was reading it, everything in there was relating to Cayman. Whatever they said about Black people and how they are over-policed, over-prosecuted, and over-sentenced, I was just thinking of Cayman. What happens in Cayman? Where, first of all, Caymanians will be discriminated against because sometimes, most of the time, not because of their race, but just because they are Caymanians. I mean, you can have a little bit of micro-racism here and there, but there isn't much of that in Cayman. And I really recommend that people should be able to read that because it will open their eyes to the system in Cayman. And I wish that some of the kinds of statistics that she has in that book in relation to the US, we could have some of those statistics in Cayman. And as you see, having lived in Cayman for as long as I had, I got to know people who were related to people who were incarcerated for 15 years and this and that, and I really started to relate to that. So I just recommend that book to anybody in Cayman. It has a lot of relevance to Cayman. I thank you this morning.
All right. Thank you so much. And again, I'm a person who believes in facts and data and information, and I'm always shocked at how little of it we have available here in this country. Even the census, the good people over at the census, when they're trying to collect data, which then the policymakers and the politicians will make decisions on how to spend money and do all these things, we have people in this country who refuse to provide that information out of pure ignorance. Oh, well, I don't want them people in my business. I don't want them to know how many TVs I got and whether I got internet or how much money my household makes. And, it's just like, the lack of understanding and knowledge is what is really going to be our biggest. Listen, the threat that we have isn't an expat threat. Okay. That's not what this is. We don't have to be afraid of, expats are going to come and take my job. I was speaking about this a little bit on yesterday's program. The greatest threat we have is our people not being adequately prepared, not having the knowledge and understanding of how to move forward in this world. That is the biggest threat that we have. Our threat is an internal threat, right? Our lack of knowledge and understanding and refusing to educate and prepare our people. That's what we should be afraid of. You're afraid of the expats. You're afraid of the wrong thing. We're the ones who are destroying our environment. We're the ones who are packed up in Northwood as prisoners, repeat offenders. We're primarily the ones who are addicts and drugs, even in Cayman Brac, destroying our own little idyllic Cayman Brac. That's on us. We're the ones, throwing garbage everywhere, no longer caring about, even how our country looks. So let's be very, very clear. Until we can address the enemy within, all the enemies without are going to have a field day, because all we are doing is making the fort less enforced. We're making it easy for anyone to come in here and take advantage of our people. Our people don't even know basic human history and human race, where the human race came from. And you talking about that other person can get a job over you on a work permit? Y'all need to make that set in for a second. You understand the degree of ignorance that we're dealing with sometimes in this country? It is a scary situation, caller. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Yeah, thanks, Sandy, for bringing in that lady. That was very, very good show. And I just have one thing to say. We as Caymanians, we suffer from two things. The fear of knowing where we came from, the knowledge of knowing. And in order to do that, we need to first of all, we need the education system to get that, I don't know what they call it, subject, I guess, into the school of history, our history. We as Caymanians don't know. So that's why we always, some of us is saying that we white, some of us say that we black, some of us are black saying that we white, and we don't know where we originated, and we're not accepting the facts of where we originated from. So we need to get back to learning about our history, and it's not taught in the schools. So the education need to revamp that and put that as a subject. It must get people in like Dr. Steve, that I always say is a wealth of knowledge. Some other people that know so much of the history, Dr. Roy, all of those people, and give a proper, overhaul of that curriculum for our school. And even the colleges, to be honest. Okay, that's all I have to say.
Thank you. I
That was a
appreciate it.
wonderful show.
Thank you so much.